And it's time to go to that next session on the BGIN Kintsugi study group. So the chair of this session is Pindar Wong. He's joining from Hong Kong. Pindar, so floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Matsuo, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me in here today in Zurich, and my thanks to the local organizers. Following on from the session, which makes the fundamental issues of stochastic finality, which is challenging many of our assumptions. My purpose here today as part of the Kintsugi study group is to explain what we've done since the last BGIN Block 5 meeting in April this year, which was dealing with twin challenges of sovereignty and substitution. So a good half of this presentation is going to be just some background with the goal of trying to recruit you to participate in the study group over the next few months before the G20 meeting in Bali at the end of this year. So can I just check, everyone can see my slides? If so, can you please give me an okay or thumbs up?
Yes, we can see the slides.
Okay, thank you so much. So again, this is the, I'm just going to get rid of my screen here, the Kintsugi study group. Now, everything you need to know about today's talk is in this picture of this broken bowl, which has been beautifully joined together with these golden threads. Now, this art of joining something so that in a sense it is better than or more beautiful than it was before is the inspiration behind the word kintsugi. And what I'm actually referring to is the internet itself, because it's my opinion that central bank digital currencies are fundamentally incompatible with today's internet. So before I get to that, I want to explain some background, which is the following. Again, the background here is we raised this initial discussion about in April this year, so about 4 months ago, in the Tokyo meeting. And to give us some inspiration, you have George Orwell's book, 1984, and so that, which imagines the world being split into sort of 3 or 4 major areas. And this diagram represents the political economy of that fictional novel. Now, that fictional novel, 1984, some took as being a warning, others have taken being a guidebook. And so what I've done is just very quickly mapped, again, fictionally, some CBDCs that are being discussed quite widely, most notably the digital dollar, the digital euro, closer to home for you in Europe, ECNY, obviously next to me in Hong Kong is mainland China, and obviously the original one, which is Bitcoin. And so if life follows art, then you could easily imagine sort of in some sense, the world splintering, or the world economy splintering into these different groups that each have a different unit of account and unit of for their settlements on their different economies. So this scenario, in some sense, is building upon the challenges posed by not only cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, but the emergence of DeFi and Web3 discussions, which are causing tensions in 2 different dimensions: the dimension of sovereignty and the dimension of substitution. In terms of sovereignty, we have 2 dimensions: the tax dimension, or fiscal sovereignty, as well as monetary sovereignty, which is the most obvious. In terms of currency substitution, this is not just for so-called traditional failed economies that have undergone dollar substitution or dollarization, but in some sense, when the coin of the realm has other choices, where the people of your given country can choose anything in terms of cryptocurrency or other digital assets with which to transact. And that also introduces, I think, a new dimension, which is not traditional challenges to fiscal sovereignty, but actually fiscal substitution, namely tax revenues that would normally accrue to your given country or your given economy going somewhere else. So these twin challenges of sovereignty and substitution are really what we've been wrestling with in the study group, which is still very early on in terms of its work. So today's talk is going to provide some context with respect to the financial internet, the internetworking of financial settlement networks in the traditional definition of what we mean by internet, versus the potential breaking up of that network into different splinter nets. We'll go through more deeply in terms of the twin challenges, sovereignty and substitution, followed by a look at several scenarios. And lastly, we'll talk about the proposed study schedule, which is quite simply 2 calls per month for the next 2 months, and possibly 4 calls in October leading up to the November G20 Bali Summit. After I finish my introduction, we'll have open mic, and if you wish, participation in this group can be anonymous or pseudonymous, but if you wish to introduce yourself, that's also welcome too. So, some context, financial internet. What do we mean by financial internet versus splinter nets? Well, the internet, as was mentioned before, was mainly, I guess, driven by the engineers who are now coming to grips with the different versions of the law, as was mentioned in the previous panel's discussion. But most importantly, as Professor Matsuo has reminded me, the internet is a global network that is actually not international. And what we mean by this is that it's not between nations. The network, unlike the telephone network, which is headquartered, well, the ITU plays a major role in Geneva, it was not actually negotiated between nation state actors, but really through commercial players creating this global network. To give comparison, we have 193, 195 nation states, depending on how you count them, whereas the internet has about, I think, over 80,000 networks, which comprise the internet. Most importantly for today's discussion is that the technology that we're dealing with is illegal, not illegal. What we mean by this is that it doesn't require the force of law for its enforcement. And you've heard through the previous session on terms of the principle of finality, and it relies again on this notion that for things to be legal, we have to have the certain ordering in order to have the force of law. Well, with not the law of letters, of which many in the room are experts at, but the law of numbers, we have encryption, which in some sense is illegal. In other words, it does not rely on the force of law for its enforcement, rather the correct implementation of some quite complicated mathematics. So with that in mind, let's go back to over 10 years ago, where this was really, again, it's a highly simplistic version of what the internet or commerce on the internet looked like, which we call on-net. In other words, on the internet, which is this base layer at the very bottom. If you ordered something online through e-commerce, then the actual settlement, your payment, would most often, for the retail side, be transacted over off-net on a traditional financial settlement network. For example, a credit card. And once that credit card has been correctly processed, the fulfillment of, depending on what you bought online, either physical delivery, off-net, in terms of off-net fulfillment, or on-net, in terms of digital delivery, for example, entertainment, that was kind of the simplistic view of the flow before Bitcoin. Now, also in the pre-Bitcoin era, in terms of how much of the e-commerce or online commerce was actually transacted, I would say close to 100% would be on this off-net. In other words, the focus would be on this arrow here inside this red circle. Now, moving forward, what's interesting now for the last decade has been not just Web3, not just DeFi, but also cryptocurrencies before that, is that we have a new pathway for financial settlement, which for the purposes of our study group, we call on-net financial settlement, which is exhibited by these shapes in orange. And so we now have a parallel path to which one can have fulfillment, either physical delivery or digital delivery, which is complete financial settlement online. So initially one can look at controversial items like going to darknets to buy illicit drugs, physical delivery of illicit drugs, or one can look at the other extreme whereby those who are interested in DeFi, for example, or Web3 are now porting over a whole legal digital asset stack and building it on top of on-net financial settlement. So for example, if we have digital assets of all descriptions that have digital delivery, then this is a different kind of world, which has drawn a lot of attention. Now, in this post-Bitcoin scenario, at least in Hong Kong, what we call scenario 4, Hong Kong, as you know, is a major international financial center. An overarching question is what percentage of this business will shift from basically off-net financial settlement, the traditional financial settlements, to this new completely on-net financial settlement? And how fast would that shift be? So one way of visualizing it is what I call the piston, the piston that will drive the new digital economy. Is it going to be off-net? Is it going to be on-net? Or is it going to be some fraction or percentage between the two? So here, this diagram is trying to represent the movement from traditional final settlement networks, which is on the right-hand side, being 100% of all different transactions, to being something less than 100%, so there's a small change, some delta C. Now, what will be interesting here is to see exactly where this delta C eventually lies. Is it somewhere in the middle in terms of total volume, or in terms of velocity? Is it actually going to be something else? Is it actually going to lean far more to the new digital asset on-net settlement mechanisms rather than the traditional off-net ones? In fact, what's actually really important, though, if one begins to look at things a little bit more closely, is not that there is going to be a delta C. It's actually the rate. In other words, it's the rate of change of transitions between one system or one architecture to another that will probably cause the biggest grief or biggest set of regulatory surprises. So one can view that as DC over DT for those of you who are a bit more numerate in this audience, of which I think there are many. The question is, it could also go the other way. You could also have a new equilibrium being established if, for example, recent events with in the DeFi world has caused some parts of the industry to be discredited. I think stable coins, which have proven to be less stable, have proved themselves that way, at least most recently. So the question is, if there is going to be a change, what does stability look like? Is there an equilibrium? And I think in a previous session, one governor mentioned this notion of backstop. Who's going to be backstopping this system, or now the system of systems? So the concern here is that once we move financial settlements completely between two different networks, that which is traditional financial networks, which are defined by geography largely, that have the rule of law to operate, and these new on-net financial settlement mechanisms, which can operate completely on-net, then that might lead to unresolvable tensions and cause the actual internet itself to splinter. And so the real question and the motivation behind this group is, perhaps assuming splintering, what is the way in which we can rejoin the different networks? In other words, to apply the philosophy of Kintsugi to perhaps have something even better, although initially it might certainly not feel that way. Again, the twin challenges here are between sovereignty and substitution. So let's dive a little bit further into what we mean by this. So in terms of economic settlement, now that we have two different mechanisms to internetwork, two different networks to, in some sense, bridge. One of them is the traditional financial settlement networks. For our purposes, we call them off-net settlement networks, the green box on your right, and the on-net settlement networks, which are right now very embryonic, and by value, at least, not that economically significant. Questions which have come up is that if the monetary supply, traditional monetary supply and different measures, M0, M1, M2, when we have de novo or new units of account appear in this on-net world, then what will sort of M-1, M-2, M-3 look like? What is stable look like? Who is going to provide the liquidity backstop if, in some sense, one of the issuance algorithms are already pre-known? Can it actually be done? Similar to the notion here, we have monetary challenges of not just monetary substitution and monetary sovereignty issues, but also on the tax side, we have fiscal substitution and fiscal sovereignty issues. In other words, if the government is no longer to obtain tax revenues in the coin of the realm, which traditionally, at least realm has at least one coin, but when you have multiple coins of the realm that comprise a certain material percentage of local economic activity, then what will be the tax regime? How will that look like? And what percentage of the government revenues will actually be obtained through this? And something that we call fiscal substitution. Now, the interesting thing here when we look at the fiscal substitution is the fiscal fundamental. And this point was brought to bear in an earlier conversation, which this slide tries to represent. And that in the fiscal side or the tax side, there's fundamentally surveillance. You have to know who is obliged to pay tax, and therefore you must surveil that economic network in order to basically ensure that the government due is correct. But more importantly, there's also the twin threat of enforcement. But when you're dealing with illegal tech, that in other words, we all like law and order, but laws have borders. And if your economic participant is not in your border, as we know from the internet governance discussions, enforcement on a global but not international network is really hard. So the real question that for those of you who governments have been wrestling with is what happens when tax networks go dark? What happens when a government is not necessarily able to see and surveil the economic networks by virtue of the fact that economic activity has moved on net? So looking at tax, using the analogy before, in the pre-Bitcoin tax surveillance world, it was really quite simple. In theory, of course, in practice, it was difficult. You surveil and you tax on the traditional financial networks that you regulate, that have their various different licenses to operate in your country, and who are party to all the usual anti-money laundering, anti-terrorist financing, and global norms that have been established. But in the post-Bitcoin world, in terms of scenario 4, as we move financial settlement on net, are we then obligated to surveil everyone on the network? In other words, surveil everyone on the global internet? And even if you manage to do so, how are you going to have enforcement? Now, right now, this is a over-the-horizon risk because I don't think any government thus far is losing so much of its tax revenue to on-net, on de novo digital assets, that it is in any risk of failing. Alternatively, financially strapped governments might look at this new way or new way of raising tax revenue as something that could be an opportunity. So where are we? We have basically tried to define the twin challenges of sovereignty and substitution across 2 dimensions. One is the monetary dimension or the currency dimension, and the other is the tax dimension or the fiscal dimension. Now, what we're trying to do in the Kintsugi Working Group is to envisage different scenarios and, more importantly, see how they might interact such that any fragmentation can either be avoided, or if there is fragmentation in terms of the Kintsugi philosophy, how can you bring them back so that things might be even better than they were before? So as we've observed in Hong Kong, we are potentially under a change in financial architecture. And so if we look forward, what will the new financial architecture look like? Now is a very good time to think hard with these new digital assets and how they emerge, in terms of what is going to be the new way to settle the future of digital business. There has been a problem, however. Most recently, we've had examples of Luna, the Luna stablecoin, Celsius, 3AC being not living up to their so-called expectations. But the biggest challenge here is that the technology is marching on exponentially, and yet quite expectedly, regulators, prudential regulators, by definition being prudent, are operating linearly. And so, for example, in the previous session, when the notion of statistical finality is perhaps incompatible with traditional versions of financially, how on earth could it possibly work? I think the same could be said of Wikipedia. You have an encyclopedia where anyone can edit. How on earth is that going to work? And yet we have it today. So it could be open thinking. We want to avoid linear thinking in an exponential world by looking over the horizon and trying to get ahead of this curve, if only to be compatible with the rate at which regulation, prudent regulation, is made. Now, the scope of change, I believe, is going to be quite significant. And particularly for those of you in Europe, the comparison I make is the potential scale of societal change is that of religious freedom, where many hundreds of years ago, the church and the state were one and the same. You would obviously be in Switzerland, you would be a Christian, and that would be it. You would not necessarily where we are today, however, is quite different, which is that this church and state, one can separate. In other words, you can, in spite of there may being a national religion, you may be free to practice whatever religion within a given state. Now, this comparison is that of money in state. Right now, every country, there's typically a coin of the realm, a single notion of money, and that the money in the state are one and the same. Now, what if the challenge that we're really trying to face here is in fact the separation of money and state? If that is true, and it's still a hypothesis, then the scope of change is going to be quite significant. And we're going to have to think very hard about its implications, particularly for governments who have bond markets, for example, and have certain ways of national saving. And if that savings base, for example, changes to investing in other markets, then there could be quite significant structural and strategic objectives that need to be rethought. So one can look at this, as I said, in terms of twin challenges, in terms of the monetary dimension, the monetary policy, monetary sovereignty, and fiscal policy in terms of tax. So this notion of stochastic finality is a tidal wave of change, and there's a lot of discussion in terms of trying to understand the implications of both. But I would argue that these challenges, the industry is marching along ahead, maybe learning and getting legal lessons at the same time per the previous panel, but it is one of the reasons why we're gathered here today in Zurich. So this group tries to distance itself from the day-to-day churn of local challenges, 3AC, etc., and take some distance to have some calm and to hopefully provide some perspective. To do that, we want to use a scenario approach, which is, what if people decide to save in a cryptocurrency that has no tax revenue for a local government? What would be the implication on government bonds, on our ability to refinance, for example? Certain given assumptions that are there might actually be fundamentally challenged. Now, today, we're not going to go through specific scenarios other than to say that we welcome all suggestions of scenarios to consider. And I'll go through some of the scheduling for that in a moment. Again, we had a foolish example at the beginning by just observing that there's this notion of currently CBDC, central bank digital currencies, and the majority of them are viewed as being for local as a national settlement within the country's borders. There are some experiments of cross-border CBDC settlement. We have some with the HK Hong Kong Monetary Authority has some work done with the BIS Innovation Group in Hong Kong. But for the large part, perhaps it might be something that is irresistible, which is to use those CBDCs once they're available to actually do other forms of settlement. For example, when your nationals go overseas as tourists, or when your online businesses are able to transact in your CBDC. Again, it's my personal opinion that CBDCs are incompatible with the internet, and if they are deployed on the internet, it'll actually fracture the internet as a whole. But that is a personal opinion, and we can discuss that some other time. So what is the study group going to discuss, and what's the study schedule? This is the proposed one, which I will circulate later after today's call. The purpose of today's call is to invite you to participate in the work of the study group. Basically, it's 3 months of work, 2 calls per month. The first set of calls will be in August. Each call is on a Monday, starting at 8 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, for whilst it's daylight savings, at least in the US. The first one will be dealing with substitution, because obviously before you have a challenge to sovereignty, you will have elements of substitution beforehand. This launching point will not necessarily take the failed states argument where local currency has been substituted by a stronger, more stable currency, dollarization being typically discussed, but rather the notion of substitution in terms of these de novo digital assets that are emerging. So Monday 8th is on the fiscal side, the tax side. The reason for the tax side is because of this fundamental to do with surveillance, that tax networks must be surveilled almost by definition with enforcement. If you can't surveil it and if you can't enforce it, does that mean your tax revenues go to zero? Or are there other ways in which we might forestall that? Create a DAO, for example, to collect tax revenue for online transactions, et cetera, et cetera. So the first one's on fiscal side, and the second one on the 22nd being on the currency side. So for currency substitution. So first month of August is on substitution. Second month in September is on sovereignty. Having explored the substitution dimension, take it to the logical extreme where you have other, at least 2 or more other coins of the realm, so-called, being circulating in your economy. What is the fiscal sovereignty issues when you have that? And secondly, on the monetary side. So each month we have a fiscal and currency dimension, the first month on substitution, the second month on sovereignty, and then by which you will be primed for generating your many different scenarios. One of the reasons why this group is open, anonymous, or pseudonymous, you're free to use your real identity if you wish, is that we don't really care who raises the scenario. We do, however, care with the quality of thinking. And we do understand one of the purposes of BGIN is to bring together parties who don't normally come together, such that we can explore potential issues, hopefully before they occur, so that we can affect the design and architecture of these systems as they are developed. So the truly interesting discussions will be exploring the different scenarios, the substitution scenarios first on Monday the 3rd, after which we will have the fourth finance ministers meeting of the G20 on October 13th and 14th. And then after that, we have the final sovereignty scenarios in time for the joint Fin deputies and Sherpa meetings on the 29th and 20th. And last but not least, we will have the 15th of November G20 Bali summit with the notion of disbanding this group by then. So it's not an infinite commitment. It's a 2.5, 3-month commitment. And then we're done. If the group wishes to continue on, I think that's something that we will have to see whether or not we actually do anything useful. So please join the Kintsugi mailing list. Here is a link at the top, and please subscribe. I think Matsuo has the details, and you can please ask him to join. What I would like to do is just go through the deliverables before opening up to discussion. So in our discussion draft, which was circulated recently, we're trying to stimulate discussion on these the twin challenges. But what we're actually trying to do is develop these scenarios within an architectural framework. The point here being, it's very difficult to reason about the fundamental changes when we have buzzwords and various different technobabble circulating. And so ideally, we can develop an architectural framework to reason about coming challenges and opportunities in monetary, fiscal, and regional trade policy. We'll try to do that by using some diagrams as a mental tool, and if necessary, develop a vocabulary of terms. So right now, I would like to move to open microphone. Please feel free to introduce yourself if you wish, but if not, that's okay too. What I'd like to do is stop here and hand back to the organizers. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. It's time for discussion. Is there anyone who start that discussion?
Thank you for your presentation. I'm not a financial specialist, so I've got some questions, maybe simple questions. When we see that there's a question of whether state and currency can be separated. We in the EU, we have the separation. So the currency is the euro, which is not belonging to the national state. Of course, you could think that EU is turning into a national state, but there are even countries outside the EU accepting the euro as their national currency. So it seems to work. Also, the national bank is currently printing quite a lot of money to finance the debts of the public sector. So this is one question, and yeah, let's start with that. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the intervention. And obviously, you're correct. At least in the EU, among the EU economies, and the trade area before that, there has been currency integration. I guess my reply to you is, has there been fiscal harmonization on that side? And as we've seen from the challenges with Greece, Italy, and others, I think the successful integration on the monetary side, I guess my question to you is that, has there been much progress, or what are the issues on the fiscal side? Certainly as the digital euro discussions have proceeded. I think was mentioned in the previous panel, you have the MICA discussions and other great progress in terms of the regulatory regime. How have the individual states negotiated their cut, I guess, of any future tax revenue that will be settled, if at all?
Well, I think this is ongoing, of course. The other question was, in Switzerland is a land of the banking secret, or has been the land of the banking secret, and it was held up quite strongly. And you say surveillance is necessary, otherwise there will not be any fiscal revenue anymore. And I don't remember a time where we had the bank secret in Switzerland, and the government still got taxes. Of course, there is tax evasion happening if you have secrecy there, but it doesn't go to zero. So there was a banking secret in many countries, particularly in Switzerland, and tax revenue existed at that time too. So it doesn't mean that there is an imminent threat of tax revenues going to zero if you have some privacy.
Certainly, but maybe you're looking at the wrong government. Yes, whilst Switzerland has its thing, if you look at the cases of UBS and others with respect to the US dollar and the obligations that I think your government undertook to conform to the US AML and other regulations, I think there are some obligations. So the privacy and secrecy the discretion, I would say, of Switzerland. If you compare it, what it is now with perhaps a decade ago, are you saying that they are the same?
Of course, the banking secret doesn't exist, at least not in a comparable form to some decades ago. So it's
Right. So I think the point here is that if a Swiss national decides to save and transact entirely with a different coin of a different realm, and that becomes a material percentage of the total economy, again, it's an edge scenario, it is a fictional scenario, then you're right now that doesn't pose, that's only pure fiction. But I think the point is, of this group at least, is to look over the horizon to explore the edge case, if only to try to identify potential fault lines before they occur. So it's not saying that it will never occur, it's saying if it occurred, then what? Which is why the scenario approach is proposed.
I guess it's a bit like with any criminality. So you can with crime. If you have more surveillance, you can fight crime better. You will never reduce crime to zero, but you have to strike a balance between freedoms and fighting crime. So there's 100% surveillance might not be the best solution, and because then you're sacrificing other things to better crime prevention.
It's actually worse than that, because not only if you did have 100% surveillance could you see what is happening, but then what? Do you actually have the ability to do the enforcement? And so it's not just the surveillance. If you look at what I put the slide before, it's actually the notion of enforcement. And fundamentally with these technologies that rely on illegal technologies which do not require the force of law for enforcement, merely evidence of cryptographic proof, then that's a pretty different world. And I think the point here is that the pace of policy consideration, I think, needs to be framed in a way that we surface these issues sooner rather than later. And that's the whole point, I guess, to provide that early warning, to provide that policy exploration for groups like BGIN who can bring different parties to the table, perhaps some of them even anonymously, so that these discussions can be had.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good questions, by the way.
Other comment, question? Okay. The Ken Katayama, so can speak.
Yes, thank you. Just wondering, hi, if you would plan to include the preceding cases in the physical world in emerging economies like Cambodia, where 70% of the economy is already run by or denominated by the US dollar, and also the tourists from the mainland China come to the souvenir shop and they're paying by the Chinese yuan and the other day, where Cambodian government cannot survey actual sales, and so that's a tax.
Sure.
Can you let's say make some analyses or comparative studies?
The answer is we will not identify specific economies. They're a sensitive nature. We can talk generally about a given economy and its, I guess, previous revenues and percentage changes, but we don't want to single out. So for example, in the Cambodia case, the use of Alipay, for example, by Chinese tourists, that's well known. And the inability for the Cambodian government at the current time, and it's still not clear to me that information is not shared with the Cambodian government. So I don't know if it's true that there's been no information shared with them. The question is degree. And I guess the question also is disclosure. So this issue to do with tax, which fundamentally has surveillance and enforcement, okay, as part of the mix. I think the better example, again, I don't want to, in the discussion draft, I used the Sri Lankan example, which since the time of writing has actually gotten worse, at least from the international news. Again, it's not trying to point the finger at any specific one economy. I think the purpose is to produce scenarios and what if economies. It's your obligation to figure out which one is the one that it applies to. But the importance here is for us to be very candid about what could happen. One of the reasons why I have a very pessimistic view with respect to the internet and its splintering because of the introduction of CBDCs is because previously the notion of a country, we fudged it in terms of something called CCTLDs, country code top level domains. So for example, .jp or .cn or what have you, and we maintained a consistent global network architecture. When you have a government potentially challenged by their financial stability or even their viability, I think the previous panel mentioned that when you start dealing with money, you get a very different kind of response. And so if you take the current internet shutdowns, which I think historically have largely been of a political nature, and one can imagine them shifting to be of economic nature, then I'm sorry, but I think economics wins. And right now, or historically, the connection to the global internet, there were more benefits than costs. But that may not be true going forward. In other words, it may cost you more to be connected to the internet. And if given a devil's choice between political stability and economic stability and this connection to the internet, I take the dim view that it will be the internet that loses. And so the possibility here and the reason for adopting the Kintsugi philosophy is to even imagine, like every bowl will break differently, which is why we don't want to name specific names with respect to countries. But every bowl, there may be certain ways bowls break that we can put back together more quickly. And the point here is that could we, if a bowl is going to break anyway, then can we put it back together even better than it was before?
I see.
With better being some subjective notion. And so that's why I think the odd name, not odd, forgive me, the term Kintsugi is actually very, very important. Previously, we called it financial internet. I had problems identifying the group on the website. Financial internet, obviously, being that we have an internetworking of different financial settlement networks, traditionally off-net and on-net. But I'm trying to get to a more nuanced view, which I think the Kintsugi philosophy and ethos, aesthetic, in fact, is more the correct term, is something that I want to raise earlier rather than later, because I think it's quite important.
Great, thank you. And by the way, my wife is very fan of the Kintsugi, and we have lots of them.
I have many broken bowls.
Thank you.
Other questions and comments? These are excellent. Thank you so much.
Other questions? From the floor or remote participants? Where? Paul, so Paul.
Hello there. You hear me okay?
Hi, Paul.
Hi. I just want to say that, I'm truly inspired by this work. I like the way you've framed it and have created a structure for us to think about these challenging issues. And, I've really not seen this type of framing since I've been working in the cryptocurrency space. And I think that in my mind, this is exactly what is needed. It's needed out of an organization like BGIN to raise these issues. And for me, it's like, this is what I hoped BGIN would always be able to do. It's to address the dramatic conflicts that we're having with this new technology and how to make it fit and how to adjust. And you know what's so exciting about this to me is that it's outlining a framework for how not only do we need to figure out how cryptocurrency fits into society, but also how society and our economic system can change in fundamental ways to be better all the way around. So I think I think you're right. Financial internet didn't really strike me, but Kintsugi does. I mean, that kind of like makes me see things in a different light and helps me see things, you know, in this framework. So I'm just inspired by this work. I'm looking forward to participating, and want to thank you for leading the charge on this. I think it's critically important.
Thank you, Paul. If I may look at my scars on my back on the internet deployment, and I know you're an internet society person previously in a previous life. A lot of the discussions, or at least even earlier, were talking about the legal framing and the legal view. And I've tried to begin today by saying, hey, look, we're dealing with illegal tech,
Right.
not illegal, not illegal. And I'm not saying it's against the law, but I am saying it is illegal, which means it doesn't need the law for its own enforcement. And again, one of the problems when, you know, it looks like a duck, or using the reasoning approach of, you know, if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck, then it must be a duck, doesn't cater for the fact that we may have a platypus, right? I mean, you know, you know, and we're dealing with something potentially different. And I think in an earlier conversation, if I may share a war story, and when you know, in the early days of the internet in Hong Kong, we were asked, you know, are you a telephone company? Can the internet do voice? And I said, yeah, in theory, voice is data, internet's a data network. Yeah, we can do voice. Oh, you must be a telephone company and you need a telephone license. And then the television regulator came up and said, hey, look, you know, can this internet thing do video? And I'm like, well, video is a picture, it's a moving picture, picture's just data. Yeah, in theory, it can do television. Oh, then you need a television license. And so a lot of the policy discussions I've seen, you know, which regulation is by product, but you know, these different silos, these different vertical silos, whereas we're seeing this platform architecture. And I think you've heard me say this before, where you go, so this timber motion, sort of this, you know, vertical to horizontal, I mean, that's going to hurt somewhere. So the question is, can we adopt a framing that provides some space for the different geometries of interest, national interest, as well as commercial interest, are free to reconfigure themselves so that society can move to this future, and that we don't just have friction everywhere. And the analogy I just made before with the intervention is, you know, if we are going to break the bowl, okay, let's do it on purpose and not by accident.
Yeah.
And I think one of the gating factors is the rate at which we can put the pieces back together again.
Right.
So if we can put the pieces back together again quick enough, I mean, the internet breaks every day, as we know, but for most users, they don't perceive it. It feels a lot more reliable than it is, than the sort of rubber bands and chewing gum that hold it together. But since many of us who know how the internet actually works think that moving a critical infrastructure that, you know, can, you know, have more than 5 nines reliability onto the internet, you know, maybe you don't want to do that. But maybe you want to move those portions where there's more gain than cost. Well, that would be certainly a smart thing to do. So thank you, Paul, for your comment. Thank you. And I look forward to your interventions on the mailing list and in the calls ahead.
You bet. Thank you.
Good. So other questions, comments? Pindar, so I have one
Please.
question. Okay, yesterday, so we had tons of discussion on the DID, SSI, and the soul bounded token.
Sure.
Like others. And today we have the discussion on the stable coins and the CBDC. I think that so each part of should be kintsugi, and so we have that we need to have some discussion on the identity matters for the financial.
Sure.
And of course, that stable coin, cryptocurrency, CDBC are part of the systems of this financial internet. So I think that we should have some that connection in that discussion regarding the financial internet at the beginning. What do you think about that? So that how we connect that discussion of the identity or stable coin and our discussion of financial internet.
So I think what's beautiful about the BGIN group is there's enough gray hair and senior expertise that we can actually make meaningful progress in addition to, I guess, the enthusiasm and of the youth. So there's a balance between, I guess, stability and new ideas. The tax issue, I think, is the reason why the tax issue, which I argue, and I think Paul really brought to the fore with his notion, is that when you have sort of zero knowledge crypto, which obviously is a bit of a mouthful, you may not, this issue to do with identity, the issue to do with identifiers and how they are managed, and if there is a way to structure it with a decentralized manager, which I think the W3Cs did spec 1.0 clearly, which is now a standard, by the way, as of a week or so ago. It provides great hope and promise, not from the perspective of wait and see what emerges. I think that's wishful thinking. What I think needs to happen is something very, very specific and very small and very tailored. So for example, if we deal with DIDs for not natural persons, not people like you or me, but DIDs for legal persons. As you know, legal persons actually don't have much anonymity, certainly with respect to a company registry to which they're registered. Obviously, there are different tax regimes and others, but having DIDs specifically for tax purposes for legal persons, I think would be quite an interesting starting point. What could even be a more interesting starting point is taking the EU as an example and leveraging the notion of that was raised earlier, that you have monetary integration in terms of the euro. And at least my understanding following the discussions on the digital euro is that this tax issue, which has been, I think, politely ignored for 20 plus years, that will eventually come to the fore, right? With the issues to do with sovereign debt, even though it may be enumerated in euro, are all the countries going to be paying and contributing to their dues from the tax perspective? So if we have a very specific, narrow case, then I'm all for having anyone participate, or at least those experts here, so-called experts, I think we're all pioneers here, participate would be good. I would request the following though, which is that there be some opportunity for regular touch points. I do expect this group to move very quickly, and because it's going to disappear in 3 months, it's bounded. And so if we can't invite regular participation, then I think periodic check-ins would be a minimum. And so what I think might be, so periodic check-ins among the chairs specifically, these should be open to anyone who wishes to join. But I think the chairs have an obligation to follow the discussions closely, and I would encourage cross-fertilization as soon as possible, but no obligation for the group members to actively participate. It's all voluntary. They can do so anonymously, but the intention here is to move quickly. And so that's the caveat. If you do participate, be prepared to work.
Okay, thank you very much. So other guys who have the question?
Leon Molchanovsky. Hi, Pindar. So the connection and what Shinichiro just mentioned, how can we cross-connect and collaborate? Some things which you mentioned, they are, yeah, some far-fetched or long horizon and a bit speculative. But there are a few things which are practically connected, can be connected to what the Decentralized Treasury Working Group is doing, and specifically socioeconomic impact. And then what there was this question about Bangladesh, or you referred to how that will impact an economy. That's where we don't, at Decentralized Treasury, we don't really talk about national economies. Maybe we do, Ali does. But regional aspects and socioeconomic impacts, that may be a link to explore together. Don't know how. Perhaps maybe in one of the calls we can go into details.
Just to build on that, and I think it's a very valid point. Not to dive into the weeds too early, but in the discussion draft, this notion of solving Triffin's paradox, in other words, this using a de novo unit of account, which was called Bitcore for the purposes of the discussion draft. When we talk about regional currencies and regional trade, specifically monies due to tariffs, for example, and tax levied at borders, that could be a more logical starting point, because fundamentally these involve networks, cross-border networks. And if it's the case that a given economy can grow faster through these introduction of these technologies and in a more stable way, then that could be quite a compelling reason for adoption. If other, obviously, tax surveillance and enforcement issues can be dealt with. So all use cases are welcome. Decentralized Treasury obviously has its own optic, but I would welcome the opportunity to work with you and share with you on some of these speculative ideas.
Okay, any other questions?
Shinichiro, could I just suggest, if possible, for those who are interested, to share the draft as it was a few months ago, if you have it available for those who wish to read it. We'll come up obviously with the next one before the first meeting, but there may be some context in the discussion draft that people need beyond today's high-level presentation, the slides of which I've shared in the chat.
Hi, Pindar. This is Ryosuke. And then I work for the government as a regulator. And then I'm wondering, do we have any kind of evaluation criteria to find out whether or not financial internet benefit us or not? So maybe obviously global internet benefit us, but we are not sure global financial internet benefit us. So, but and the answer could be different from what kind of perspective you have. And then, for example, from financial inclusion perspective, maybe it's good. But from other perspective, like money laundering, and then maybe environmental sustainability, and then answer could be different. And then it can be different by country. And then
Yes.
Especially if you bring this kind of discussion to the G20 meeting, it's an international alliance among developed countries which have great capability over monetary and fiscal sovereignty. So obviously, they are much important than global financial internet for many government officials. So maybe we needed to provide some specific framing or scope if we expect something out of the D20 discussion going forward. So I'm wondering, do you have any idea on that?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Do I expect anything meaningful from the G20? As you know, having worked with the G20 process before, even getting any of the language change is a Herculean task. No, I don't, not at this stage. But you're absolutely right in having some so-called success criteria is, I think, also essential. The problem I have with success criteria is the current notion that most of the outcomes, at least with the financial world, are zero sum. In other words, traditional assets are that either I have it or you have it. With digital, we can have something different, which is we both can share an asset. And so it's not property law that provides the legality that necessarily needs the enforcement. It could be a different one. So I think success will be also in the eye of the beholder, because it may not need to take a zero-sum mentality. But I am sympathetic for those people who come from a very traditional world, that there needs to be some way of engaging. The reason why I'm reticent right now is because I think I'm trying to keep things very loosely framed. If we just port the old world and with their own success criteria into this discussion, I think we'll end up with the same stalemate and loggerheads in terms of policy discussion that we've seen elsewhere. So how do we have this relaxation of constraints, the slight relaxation of the geometry of national interests and commercial interests? That's what I'm actually looking for. So I'm a little bit reticent to do so now. I agree with you that success criteria are critically important for adoption, but I still think we're actually in the exploration surfacing stage. And I want this surfacing stage to be deliberate, because right now we're getting surprised again and again and again with all the blowups in crypto. And I think I've warned elsewhere that I think these surprises are going to happen faster and sooner and more frequently. So I think we're already behind the curve. And so we need a way of framing to get ahead of the curve. And I think that's what I'm trying to do here. So I'm not sure if that directly answers you, but I'm trying to get to the principle with which I'm trying to steer this group.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
So is there any other person has a question? If no, that it's time to close this session. Thank you, Bernard, Pindar, and everyone who had a great discussion. And I strongly encourage all persons who are interested in this work, please join that Kintsugi mailing list and join that our upcoming bi-weekly calls. Thank you very much, Pindar, and everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.